I think that that implementation is somehow tied up with this whole business of protection of instructional time. And let me say that when I use that phraseology, I'm not just talking about the 40-minute period in the secondary classroom. I'm not just talking about turning off the microphone or being sure that there aren't announcements made every 10 minutes or letting Winter Carnival completely obliterate a week of instruction. But I'm talking about protecting instructional time in other ways too. Being sure that teachers have time to prepare for instruction. Setting up the context in which a teacher A can talk with teacher B about the same type of course and what they're doing and what works and what doesn't work is another way of protecting instructional time, because it helps people evaluate what they are doing as individuals. Let's go on then to the next trend that I had identified, which was seeing or recognizing the fact that values underpin everything that we do. That one I have a great deal of difficulty about, because, as I said, I don't have a very good background in the humanities. And when somebody starts talking to me about values, my immediate reaction is whose values, when, where, and how. And that's a very natural reaction, I think, particularly to those of us in the administrative role. But political events in Canada right now, I think are pointing out to us that our society is wanting us to be much more value-oriented in our thinking. Not to espouse your values or my values or somebody else, but to recognize what is there as an underlying assumption in what we do. The recent ruling, that was an interesting inversion, relative to the Abortion Act, I think is a clear indication that Canada, which has relatively recently adopted a Charter of Rights, correctly or incorrectly, is ready for us to ask questions about the values of what we're doing in schools. I wonder if we're ready to ask those questions, but they have to indeed emerge. Waller in 1932 described schools as museums of virtues. I wonder if we would describe them as museums of virtues in 1988. I wonder if we want to describe them as museums of virtues in 1988, because a museum is where you walk around and look in little cases at things that are set on pedestals. I wonder if we wouldn't more correctly act as trial places for values in 1988. Schools really have to reflect the dominant values of their communities. I think being a little bit of a nomad has helped me come to grips with the fact that there's nothing wrong with schools being different in St. John's than being different in Bonaventure, being different in Port Hawkesbury, being different in Tabasantac or Miramichi or wherever you are. That in fact, values, and community values in particular, provide the educational administrator with working rules and with a context. It's rather encouraging to see some people who have been hard-nosed ed-admin types beginning to write more and more in philosophical veins. I sometimes question if they know any more about philosophy than I do, and I certainly hope they do. But when I see whole books like Chris Hodginson's book on the philosophy of ed-admin, I'm quite encouraged. Not that I understand it, but I am encouraged by it. Sergio Vanni, who every graduate student I'm sure has been subjected to at some stage or the other, has even started writing in the vein of, we've got to look at the philosophy of what we're doing in ed-admin. Erdmann, who happens to be a lady born in Germany who's currently living in Nova Scotia and writing rather extensively with some of the people at UCLA, was quoted in the Atlantic Insight, that's my heavy reading for the month, as saying, values are interrelated. Intelligence without love will destroy. And love without responsibility will degrade. If we look at the three, then we see wisdom and the elevation of mankind. Let me run through that for you again. Intelligence without love will destroy. Love without responsibility will degrade. Together, you get wisdom and the elevation of mankind. Notice that wisdom, then, has to logically reflect responsibility. And that responsibility has to logically reflect love. One of the jobs that I've fallen into, and in some ways it's a delightful job, and in other ways it's a very frustrating and time-consuming job, is the interviewing of potential BED candidates at our institution. Now, we're a relatively small institution. We keep our BED program at approximately 60 candidates, so we have 30 secondary and 30 elementary school teachers graduating each year. One of the things that I keep hearing again and again and again and again as I talk with these potential candidates is, I want to teach school because I love kids. I've come to the point where I am almost physically ill when I hear that statement, because so often it doesn't recognize the fact that in love lies responsibility. And that to be kind and gentle and long-suffering with children isn't enough for a teacher. And let me say that I don't believe that being kind and long-suffering with teachers is an appropriate activity for principals, if in fact there isn't a clearly established responsibility for the teaching act. Okay, if my trend is correct, then in fact a couple of actions from the principal seem to be appropriate. One is that principals will have to be able to guarantee equity in the treatment of persons in their schools. That is, if values do in fact underpin what we're doing. And two, principals will have to have wisdom. And every time I say the word wisdom, I think of dear old Solomon. And Solomon, in fact, wasn't always very kind in his wisdom, but he did always tie responsibility to it. Remember the story about the two women who claimed the baby? In his wisdom, he resolved that problem by looking at responsibility. If it's really your true baby, you'll love it and you will be responsible for it. Responsible enough to give it up in a context in which it will suffer. I'd like to read you one more quotation at this point, if I may, as I move on to the next trend, which is identifying the function of schools in the society in which we are. There are important differences between schools that are attributable to There are important differences between schools that are attributable to variations in instructional and community context and to school and community cultures. And these differences have major consequences for school principals in terms of strategies and orientations that will enable them to administer their school effectively. There is also enduring similarity across schools in terms of role demands associated with the school work situation itself, and the principal's effectiveness is, in large part, a function of the degree of fit between the role demands of the school and their own personal background. Now, that was a long quotation to say what I really want to say, is that if the principal isn't aware of what his local society, her local society wants of his or her schools, then the probability of delivering the product is extremely low. There's also another point there that I would like to emphasize a bit, and that is to say that a principal who is effective in one school is not necessarily effective in another school. We've made a rather stupid practice in assigning principals. And that is, we've assumed that the good teacher is going to be the good principal. And somehow we've made the teacher who hasn't been offered a principalship feel unimportant, insecure, unwanted, unloved. And we've not helped principals who in fact may indeed, even with their good teaching ability, be super principals, aware that there are differences between working with children than there are with adults. I'll go back to something I said earlier. The wise principal will know self, and will know self well enough to know over time the context in which they can be effective and the context in which they can't be effective. There's a rather frightening policy in one of the Ontario boards in which I did some consulting, which is an interesting policy, and that is that no principal shall stay in the same school more than 5 years. Wow. What has happened is that as a principal is assigned to a school, they know they're there for 5 years. Not that they're going to necessarily be moved if they're not effective. They're there. And in 5 years' time off, they're going to go somewhere. If, in fact, that type of policy is not modified by some careful description of what the principal is to do in that 5 years, tell us what to do and we'll do it, then the policy can as equally create havoc as it can create good. There is, in fact, a need to match your skills as principals with the school context. Let me give you another example from the Nova Scotia situation in which I'm currently working. I have the privilege of working with teachers on one of the Micmac reserves. And the community expectations for schools is very different in that context. And what has tended to happen, and I think it's unfortunate, hey, there's a Gail, is that the schools for Native children have virtually been forced to adopt Nova Scotia school curriculum without any real recognition that they're coming from a different philosophical perspective. And so what happens with a principal who's placed in that situation, who does not understand the philosophy of the community, which is a very special community, is complete, absolute frustration. And a person who is completely and absolutely frustrated cannot be effective. You need some frustration to be productive, but too much frustration kills. Okay, going on to the next trend, and my time is going quickly, isn't it? I'm sorry. Quickly for me, slowly for you, I'm sure. The instrumentality of the role of the principalship. A number of people have talked about that in recent years. Willower is one of the people who probably gets the most print about it. But what I'm saying when I say that one of the trends for the principalship is that they have to recognize their instrumentality is that they have to recognize the fact that they are in the schools to, and here comes the old catchy word from the 60s, to facilitate instruction. That in fact, their job is one of helping teachers be certain that they're improving and allowing them to do the job for which they've been hired. I don't have any problem at all with the expectation that a school's new teacher should be the person who's really active with students in out-of-school types of activities. I do have a problem with it, however, when it puts that new teacher in the position that they have to spend 35 hours a week in class preparation, and that's pretty minimal for a new teacher, and 35 hours a week in the school gym or doing the musical or whatever. I get very upset as I watch teachers being transferred from a situation in which they were relatively effective to a school in which they don't understand what's happening because it's a new environment for them. They're perceived as being losers because haven't they been transferred? Surely there must be something wrong. Don't principals manage to send their worst teachers off and not the best? Where does seniority come into this? So automatically the stigma of loser goes with the transferred teacher. Automatically the bottom of the bucket routine comes with the new teacher. When we do that as administrators to teachers, are we in fact being instrumental in our roles? Are we providing conditions in which people can in fact grow and develop? I'm not very familiar with the curriculum changes that are occurring in Newfoundland, and I apologize for that. Had I done my homework well, I'd have been able to pull one out quite quickly. But I think there's a time, and I'm going to get myself in trouble here, I can tell, upper echelon sitting at the front table, in which a principal has to lead her teachers in subversive activity. The elementary school teacher who is facing 3 or 4 or 5 curriculum changes in a 2 or 3 year period cannot realistically make those changes. And when I say I think that principals will have to learn to be subversive, what I'm saying is I think that they're going to have to learn, you're going to have to learn to help your teachers set priorities. It's realistic. We can, this year, really make a major thrust toward changing the math program, or make a major thrust toward changing the French program, or make a major thrust toward changing from one approach of science to another approach of science. But we can't do all three at the same time. So as a school, we will do this year, and we'll gradually swing into the others next year. And central office, I'm sorry, but they just can't take any more. And yet, being close to the bottom of a management position in a school system makes that a very threatening activity for us as school principals. And if we don't do it, the changes that are wanted above are never going to happen anyway. A very simple curriculum change takes teachers between 5 and 7 years to really become comfortable with. The fact is, and it's an encouraging one, that if we take our time in those changes, then change number 2 occurs more quickly than change number 1, and change number 3 occurs more quickly than change number 2. Okay, let me move on quickly then to the principal as person. The trend refers to the need of the principal to be authentic in their relationships with people. Authenticity is a hard characteristic with which to operate because we have these images of ourselves that get in the way. It's very hard for a teacher to say to a student, I don't know. And it's even harder for a principal to say to a teacher, I don't know. Because haven't we sort of been conditioned to believe that we should, in fact, be the experts on things? Authenticity also involves sharing our philosophy of schooling with our faculty. Sharing our philosophy of human nature with our faculty. Not imposing, but sharing. That's another word that I guess has become a rather hollow word. But being real. Well, if we have to be real, we have to be authentic. We have to be authentic not only with our principals, and other principals rather, our teachers, but we have to be authentic with our view of schooling with the public. And that would seem to me to suggest that another action for the principal of the future will be developing the ability to articulate the appropriate role of the school in the society it serves, actually being willing to stand up and state it, and secondly, going back to something I said a little earlier, assessing what, in fact, they can do. I just did that, didn't I? Whoa, did I get lost on that one? Let's try it again. Being publicly articulate about their philosophy and learning to work within it, and being skilled in the protection and development of the staff toward the instructional ends that come from the shared philosophy. Going on then to the last point, which is excellence and standards. The call for accountability, in fact, is really a call for the schools to say what they're about. This whole school reform movement is one with which I am very frustrated, because I think it has set some rather limited roles for schools, but one in which I'm encouraged because it has in fact said to school people, it is time and it is okay to talk about schooling. It is time and it is okay to think of the school, the individual building, as an organization. It is time and it is okay to set your standards for development. In that whole process of school reform, however, the principal sits on a fence. And it's a fence under which there's a rotting post on one end and a steel post on the other. And somebody is rocking that fence, and it's going to be a very hard ride. Something is going to give somewhere. Boundary spanning is probably the more difficult role that the principal plays now, and will probably continue to be a very difficult role. If in fact we in schools do not have standards and short-term as well as long-term shared goals for our students and for ourselves, then we probably will not do any better in the future than we're doing now. I'm not saying we're not doing a good job now, but I'm saying that we will not be able to be responsive to that cry for accountability. Manasse has written recently that leaders lead. It doesn't seem to me that I've ever picked up anything about the principalship that hasn't at some point said principals are leaders. And if in fact you are leaders, and if in fact leaders lead, then you have to be leading in some direction. You have to be leading a change. Not a massive change, but a change. Maybe it's a change in attitude, maybe it's a change in work. I've said that the school reform movement has me somewhat fearful, but more of the fear is housed in the fact of what I see being advocated as teacher effectiveness and very, very adoptable. I would like to caution you against the fallacies of other places and the difficulties of other places who are very much involved in school reform movement. It's great to have teachers talk to teachers and to develop a vision. It's critical for the direction of the school. It's critical to have teachers develop new teaching skills. It's critical to recognize that the effective use of instructional time is important. But it's even more critical to recognize that we are a people industry, that teachers are people, students are people, and we can't just blindly act on them as if they are cognitive products. If that's the case, then I would suggest three further actions for the principal. Interesting order there. Principals will have to develop the skills to enable stakeholders in their school to develop a philosophy and an agenda for reform. And my secretary is on vacation, you can tell. Principals will have to be able to identify clear long-range goals for reform in their staffs, the shared vision. Principals will have to be able to identify problems in their schools which may hamper the achievement of that vision among the humans that are there in the corporate action. Now, I've been very long-winded, much more so than I thought I was going to be, and I apologize for that. But let me say in closing, please, that in reflecting on what I've said about the emerging role of the principalship, I don't claim to be saying anything new, or to be saying anything that isn't happening to some degree in all of your schools. I am, however, pleading for a view of the future which accommodates our pluralistic society. A view of the future that accommodates the reality of teachers and principals as people, and a view of the of the future, which really sees the principal's key position as being one of unlocking other person's potentials and not necessarily just their own. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wright. We have about 15 minutes, I make it, before our nutrition break. And so we're going to go into a short period for discussions. While you are thinking about the some questions or some reaction to Dr. Wright, there's two other quick little things. One is that the minister, as you know, was supposed to be here this morning for greetings. Unfortunately, he was informed last night when he arrived back in town that somebody, a close friend of his, had just passed away, so he's at the funeral home this morning and hopes to get around to see us sometime during this week, and you can be sure that you can count on that he will be here. There are, for those of you who want to have some interaction with Dr. Wright, we'd like to tell you that there are some microphones around. Would you just raise your hands as I can see it? And Roger Grimes or Richard Harvey has the mics there, and they'll scurry along and pass one to you. The only reason for this is so that we can get you on tape, and you might want to look at yourself on television at some point as well, and that's very important. Okay, not to detract from what we have just heard, Dr. Wright's paper, by the way, is available at the, pardon me, at the counter, I believe, down here for you to pick up so that you can read it at your leisure a little later on. But I'd like to avail of the next 10 to 15 minutes for some discussion and interaction with her directly. Somebody want to start it off, please? Gwen.
Thank you so much. I want to say a personal thank you. I really needed to hear what you had to say this morning. But early in your presentation, there was a word that clicked in my mind as you brought up some of the characteristics of principals. And I'd like to have a response from you about this characteristic, which I think is essential. And that is that principals today in planning for our emerging society have to be risk takers. And specifically, you know, if we look at the curriculum, we have to encourage ourselves to challenge the curriculum, and that's a risk that we take because we don't like to question our own thoughts and our own philosophies regarding curriculum or, pardon me, the purpose of schooling today. And not only challenge our own thoughts, but to challenge the thoughts of teachers in our schools and to challenge our students to think about what the purpose of schooling is. And that is a threatening thing to consider. I always remember a comment that somebody paraphrased which said, "Oh, to see ourselves as others see us," but more importantly, "Oh, to see others as they see themselves." And I think if we look at the student's perspective and their purpose of schooling and the teacher's perspective and their purpose of schooling, what a risk that we're taking, but what a risk we need to take. I wonder if you'd care to comment.
You've said it very well. Principals indeed are going to have to be more willing to take risks, but when you say that, there's also a danger that you develop the rebel principal. I talked at one point about subversion as being a part of a principalship's job, and I think that's clear risk-taking. But you have to also look at how strongly you feel about the ship in which you're going to be subversive. If, in fact, you're going to question every change, and if, in fact, you're going to stand against every change, then you probably aren't any more reflective than the person who doesn't stand against any change. So at the same time as saying, yes, we do have to be risk takers, let's be sure the causes in which we take risks are real ones and not false ones. Sounds like we can go have coffee now.
I'm just waiting for those who are a little hesitant to get going because I don't believe that there aren't more people who want to have something to say, I'm sure. Gwen Tremblay.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Wright. I'd also like to echo Beverly's comments this morning. I thoroughly enjoyed everything you had to say, and I needed to hear that too. I have some concerns, however, about the direction that we seem to be going in. Recently, and we hear another buzzword, another phrase in administration, in schooling, the whole area of effective schools. I have a great deal of concern that somehow we have gone beyond that, and yet we're not recognizing the framework that will be presented to us in that regard. I wonder if you could comment on where you think that might lead us and perhaps where we should be going.
Well, persons like Dr. Mulcahy would obviously argue that what tends to happen in schooling or any public institution is that you go very far in one direction and then you gradually swing back to another direction. I keep wondering if we have to be so reactive and less proactive in schooling. Several times this morning I have stated my own prejudice, which is that schools are for more than cognitive development. That cognitive development cannot be lost in the purpose of schooling, but it also cannot be the only purpose in schooling. And when I look at what has happened in many contexts with the, quote, excellent school movement, what I have seen happening is that we do have an overthrust toward cognitive development at the risk of the other aspects. I don't know how we necessarily overcome that, except to suggest that I hope people in Newfoundland and Labrador aren't like people in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia who assume that because something happened in Ontario X number of years ago, it has to happen in the East later. And we've been very much inclined on the mainland to adopt, without asking the right questions, innovative movements. And I'm afraid that's going to happen in our, quote, school reform, effective school movement. I hope we can avoid it.
Dr. Wright, I want to thank you again for your very knowledgeable remarks this morning and their challenge to the group here. There's one thing I did want to question you a little further on. That's the, I sense a bit of a conflict in yourself, I guess, in change reform in the schools, and particularly as it relates to the principal's role. You maintain from the beginning, and rightly so, that the principal has to have the cooperation of his staff in order to accomplish things. At the same time, he has to respect the teachers and the work that they're doing. They're the people who actually do the work in the school. At the same time, I sense a little harder line in the sense the principal should know what he or she wants in the school and should be prepared to demand a certain accountability amongst the staff. Mm-hmm. How does one reconcile those two, and particularly into a situation that may have been ongoing for some time?
You're obviously right, Alan, in the sense that, yes, there is that quandary in my mind, and that is the quandary in any administrator's mind. I like to say that in the midst of the conversation frequently, I talked about a shared vision of the school. That doesn't mean that everybody in the school is going to operate effectively within that vision, but if in fact you as an administrator and your staff have developed a position that says this is the direction in which we're going in the school, this is what we see as effective instruction in the school, this is what we see we want our students immersed in, then you have the same responsibility of an administrator at any level, which is to see that that can happen, and that becomes the instrumentality aspect. Obviously, the fact that we have an aging teaching population suggests that we are going to have very strongly ingrained teaching behaviors. They aren't necessarily wrong. They aren't necessarily right. and to allow ourselves to slip into the false feeling that, well, we really can't do anything over the next 10 or 15 years. Really all we can do is to maintain, is to abdicate our responsibility and leadership. I think we do have to come to the point that our staffs have said, this is where we want to go, and you say, okay, I'll help you go in that direction, but I am still the person who has to call the fact that the game isn't being played or is being played. Somebody has to have a critical objective view, and the principal is the person in that position, organizationally. It's not easy. They need coffee.
Is there another last question? Last chance. Yes, sorry.
Again, I'd like to echo the previous comments and thank you, and I wished you luck last night, and I think you did a wonderful job. You spoke of three main focuses of the principalship, that being one of instruction, one of politics, and one of administrivia, I suppose. You may not be aware, in Newfoundland, in schools with a population of less than 250 children, principals are expected to teach 50% of the time. I'm wondering in your research or in your readings if you've have come across some findings when that indicate the amount of time a principal might need to be effective in these three areas.
I think that most of the research on the principalship that has looked at the question of time has asked the question, how does the principal use his/her time, as opposed to how should the principal use his/her time. That whole business of the teaching principal versus the non-teaching principal is a question in almost every province. I think realistically that school boards have to recognize that as soon as they've put a principal in a school in a full-time or near full-time teaching job role, that they're saying in essence, we do not expect leadership from the principal, we expect management from the principal. That reality has its limits of what the person can do. That, in fact, a principal who finds himself, herself in that type of situation has to say, too, look, I can do the administrivia for you. I can assign some of the administrivia to some of the other workers in my school who have good abilities to do it. But realistically, I can only set one or two of the non-managerial types of roles for myself, to the human development roles. I can't do everything. And again, it becomes a bit of subversion, but reality.
Okay, that's probably an interesting point to close on, Dr. Wright, because I sense some adrenaline beginning to flow. I see some people saying yes to what you were just saying, some people shaking their heads no to it, and I'm trying to remain neutral on the point.
We know your perspective.
Obviously, I just raised one little scenario. You can get back at me if you wish, and that is that some of the research that I have seen, and I'm sure you have seen this as well, it doesn't seem to necessarily accord a high correlation between the amount of time the teachers have free from teaching and that of educational leadership that they have found among people who are teaching a fair amount of time, people with total administrivia, if I want to use that leanings, and certainly the other way around. So that correlation is not necessarily there.
What you've said by saying that, again, it comes back to the principal as an authentic person, the principal who, in fact, sees his/her role as an instructional leader is going to use the time that's available more effectively by doing things like getting somebody down the hall to take care of the milk money, or to take care of an order form for this, that, or the other thing. It's a matter of having a vision of what instructional leadership is in that context.